visiting us from Exeter University in the UK. Rob has 16 years experience as a health services researcher and economic evaluator, both in the NHS and in Australia. He worked here at CHERE from 2001 to 2005, and since 2005 he's been a senior health economist in the Peninsula Technology Assessment Group at the University of Exeter, where they directly support NICE's technology assessment, technology appraisal program. Rob's happy to be visiting us in Australia because he misses the coffee and the kayaking. But more seriously today, he's going to present to us some work on HTA as policy evaluation, reflections on 8 years supporting decision-making by NICE. Thanks very
much, Rebecca. Hello, everybody. First of all, thanks to CHERE for inviting me to give this talk, but most especially for hosting my stay and providing me with a desk and internet access over the past few weeks and coming next week. When my institute does seminars, they tend to just be lectures with like 5 minutes for questions at the end. We're not allowed to call anything a lecture anymore because that's too didactic, so all of the things that the undergraduates get are called plenaries.
Called what? Plenaries.
But they all end up doing the same thing. But I would like this to be a seminar, so I know many of you well enough, and you know me well enough to chip in if something doesn't make sense or you just want me to slow up. So let's go. Okay, so a quick plan of what I want to talk to you about today. I'll give some context to the work I've been doing in the UK over the past several years, and then I'll explain what I mean when I say that we should look at health technology assessment as policy evaluation. I think I should preface this by perhaps saying that I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with HTA, as many people I think who do it do, because it's all-consuming and doesn't allow you to do other types of research when you've got one on your desk, and then you kind of emerge into the light afterwards wondering, what shall I do next? The topics I've picked to talk about here kind of relate to the front end of health technology assessment, trying to work out what it is we should be evaluating the cost effectiveness and effectiveness of. And then towards the end I'll talk a bit more about how that can also create problems in terms of if you end up with models that are too complex and results that are too complicated, we end up providing something which is not fit for purpose for decision making. So, a bit of context about where this is coming from. So NICE there's a distinction in the processes I feed into between technology appraisal, which is very much the decision-making process, and that is run by and conducted by NICE, and its mandatory guidance, which is to the whole of the NHS in England and Wales. What I've been doing is technology assessment, which is the provision, summary, synthesis of scientific evidence, and this is currently done by 9 academic units. Actually, Klein and systematic reviews and BMJ evidence don't actually sit within universities, so this has been a change since about 2014 when they wanted to broaden the range of units doing this type of work. To put the technology appraisal into context, I think PBAC meets, is it 3 or 4 times a year? 3. Okay, well NICE has 4 technology appraisal committees, each of which meet 11 times a year, and each of those is 25 to 30 people of clinical backgrounds, medical statisticians, health service managers, and various other representatives. So it's a fairly big policy-making machine within the UK.
Sounds like an employment programme.
And so NICE has been doing this since 1999, so we started a bit later than you got technology assessment going in Australia. It's changed its name, if not its acronym, and its remit at least 2 times. So the Health Development Agency got absorbed into it in 2004, and policy became part of its remit this year. So, HTA teams, we are the backroom boys. Nobody really knows we exist and that we produce these huge tomes to inform what turn out to be quite important decisions. Even Mike Drummond last week, 2 weeks ago at the IHEAR conference, kept using the phrase, nice, doing these assessments. Nice don't do the assessments. It's the independent teams who perform rigorous and evidence-based analyses of the current evidence. So, what does each of these technology assessment projects involve? We draft a protocol from NICE's scope, so there's a bit of a toing and froing between the policymakers saying this is what we want you to look at and this is how we want you to look at it, and we go back to them and say, well actually we think you want us to look at this really. Then we do a systematic review of clinical effectiveness, a systematic review of cost effectiveness, we do a critical appraisal of the manufacturer's submissions, and we will nearly always do a new model-based cost effectiveness analysis. And this will, of course, have to be wrapped up in a clear and comprehensive report. And then there's a series of meetings, depending on whether it goes to appeal, etc. So this is what we call the multiple technology assessment. There is another faster track of assessment, which is a bit more like the processes you have here for PBAC, which is purely based on a critical assessment of a manufacturer's submission. But I'm mainly going to be talking today about insights from the MTA process. It's also inherently adversarial, which kind of focuses the mind. And so you're aware that with a team of, say, 5 or 6 people to work for a few months, you may have a much larger team based in a pharmaceutical company who are going to be able to pore over your analyses and reports and try and pick holes. So that does focus the mind. So there's a kind of guided tour of the human body that I've been through over the past 8 years. Mixture of devices, medical devices, and drugs. And in the case of the transplant for end-stage kidney disease, that was actually evaluating a different way of storing kidneys. So we ended up with a model where the first half of the model was to simulate organs, and then the second half of the model was to simulate human beings. My love-hate relationship with HCA is that I've done so many of these things, I get a bit of a heart-sink feeling when the new one comes in the door, but I generally only need about a day of working on it that I find new and interesting things in it. So I hope I'll bring up some of the new and interesting things that I like, as opposed to the heart-sink things that drag me down. So there's an external view of how HCA works, if you like a textbook view, where you get these pre-specified, neatly defined comparators in the scope. And of course, as contracted HTA research group sitting under NICE, we've got highly specified guidance on how we should be doing our analyses. We've also got assay interventions if the guidance doesn't tell us what to do. And these, of course, all have to be squeezed into pre-specified report formats, etc. Gives the impression that we've got very clear goalposts and that it's a very linear process. Essentially, we're just applying a recipe. But it very rarely works out like this. In the context of developing decision model-based analysis to inform bodies like NICE, health technology assessment is actually about assessing alternative ways in which given health technology could realistically be recommended for use in a given health system. And this changes the game considerably. Because when you try and specify these alternative ways, they need to be discrete, they need to be specifiable, and they need to be relevant to either usual clinical practice or at least be feasible within the healthcare and infrastructure and processes prevailing in your health system. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless to be generating cost-effectiveness estimates for anything that sits outside that definition. So how can we be more definitive about decision problems? Well, if we look to the literature, we're supposed to create clear and logical and evidence-based model structure. and an explicit description of the parameters and how they're chosen. There's very little description about what actually goes into a decision problem. So it's supposed to be based on all the available evidence across the full range of possible alternative interventions and clinical strategies. Now, anybody who's plotted anything on a cost-effectiveness plane knows how important it is not to admit even a single comparator, because it could shift your frontier and change all of the ICEs, or all the incremental cost-effectiveness ratios, that is, just by adding one more dot to your constellation of alternatives. So this question, what does a clearly specified decision problem actually comprise? And how do you arrive at it in a logical, transparent and evidence-informed way? So I'm going to talk to a couple of examples here, looking at firstly the way scopes are defined, usually in kind of a standard PICO format. So that's the patient group, comparators, interventions and outcomes, and how you end up with something that's actually specifiable within the decision model so that you can actually generate some cost-effectiveness estimates. So the first example is one when we looked at cochlear implants for hearing impairment back in 2008, ended up being considered in 2009. First of all, you've got two recipient groups who have very different characteristics in terms of what hearing means for them. I'm not a medical expert, but last time I checked, I've got 2 years. So this means the technology can be used once or twice on the same person. And another important consideration is that they're fairly irreversible operations. So that's defined on my scope as we received it, recognising that you can wear 1 or 2 cochlear implants. And then more detail about the standard comparators. But it turns out, once we started talking to clinicians, that there are 3 different ways of having 2 cochlear implants. There's simultaneous bilateral implantation, which is when the clinical decision is made at one point that somebody needs 2 cochlear implants. There's staggered bilateral implantation, where you've got the same clinical decision, but the operations are staggered, and that means that there is a point of reversibility where the second one might not happen. And then you might have a cochlear implant user who's been living with a single cochlear implant for a decade or more. Now, would adding a second one at that time point actually produce the same outcomes as bilateral implantation? And it turns out that there was no effectiveness evidence for some of the comparators to do with having a cochlear implant on one side and a hearing aid on the other. And for the adding a second implant for an established implant, there was also no effectiveness evidence. So if we consider the population of people with no existing cochlear implants, they could stay without one, go to having 1 or 2 staggered or 2 simultaneous. So we've got a more complicated decision problem immediately from the PICO framework. As it turned out, there was no evidence to do with staggered implantation, so we simply couldn't simulate that one. If we were looking at a model for people who already have 1 cochlear implant, again, there have been no trials of adding a second cochlear implant for people with one who have been living with one cochlear implant for some years. So the next example is, so that's an example where the same technology can be used once or twice. This example is where a particular technology has multiple components and multiple outcomes. So this is cardiac synchronization therapy, or sometimes called biventricular pacing for heart failure. And there's a standard device, which is pacing only, or there's one which also includes a defibrillator, a cardioverter defibrillator. So that's an implantable cardioverter defibrillator. So as soon as you have devices which have multiple components and therefore affecting multiple expands the whole population who need to be considered in your choice there. And so for the people who both have risk of atrial fibrillation and this left ventricular systolic dysfunction, you've got to consider all three. Bizarrely, NICE insisted that they take the ICD only option out when we evaluated it. 4 years later, when they evaluated it, they decided to put it in. So there's the initial basic scope, and here's how we ended up having to re-specify it. So this is optimal pharmacological therapy is the usual care, if you like. Then there's just the cardiac resynchronization therapy pacing device, the one that has the defibrillator built into it, or ICD only. Again, we were not so much due to lack of evidence, but due to policymaker insistence, they wanted to rule this out of our analysis. But we thought it was illogical at the time. And they seem to have changed their minds. However, if they've only got cardiac synchrony and LVSD, there are only two comparators. So what we've got here is breaking down into lots of different decision problems, and the decision problems themselves becoming more complicated with multiple comparators. So let's go.
Right, sorry,
Yeah.
in that example, and I'm just thinking about the implementation of what you produced, you said that 4 years later they then reconsidered the introduction of ICD as a comparator. Did they have to have this redone?
Yes, they essentially, it was the Southampton team that did it 4 years later. They just expanded the decision problem.
Right.
I hope it's because they saw the sense of not ruling out, because the two decision problems are joined effectively. That's how I see it.
But isn't that because most NICE guidance has a review date on it?
Yeah, but they decided to combine them in this instance because I think they're joint problems, and it didn't make sense to kind of carve out some of the alternatives because they're actually because of the existence of this device which has both functions, it turns it into a single decision problem in my opinion. But because they were so far down the policy process, they couldn't, when we did it, they couldn't join them together. They probably already had another team looking at ICDs, so they're going to tread on somebody else's team.
Well, I missed the first bit, so you may have covered this, but you said, so there's the NICE drafts a protocol, which has this sort of PICO criteria.
No, the NICE drafts the scope.
The scope.
Yeah.
And then you said that you got the sort of clinical expert almost said this problem's bigger. We need more comparators, etc.
Yeah.
So how does that impact? Does NICE not get the clinical input at the early stage, at the scope stage?
They do, but I think sometimes things get missed, or sort of logical or clinically plausible options get missed. And it's sometimes because the clinical community will be very set in their view of what's a feasible way of delivering things. And that might be different from what the clinical evidence says is actually feasible. So sometimes whole clinical communities have moved on. So in the area of screening for liver cancer in people with cirrhosis, everybody had moved to ultrasonography and all sorts of fancy ways of creating images of livers. And there was this biochemical test called AFP, which was totally unfashionable and everybody thought, it doesn't work. But when we did the review of the evidence, for example, it showed that even though AFP, if you analysed it alone in terms of test accuracy, it was performed much less effectively than the imaging technologies. It was still much better at detecting smaller and more treatable cancers. And so sometimes comparators don't end up in the scope because of firmly held views in clinical communities which may not actually reflect the possibilities that the evidence portrays. way technologies are used complicates decision problems. Of course, there are other examples of this. It might be the dose or duration of treatment or the frequency of application of the technology. If your systematic review of clinical effectiveness reveals there are particular subgroup effects, then again that might force going back to the drawing board and drawing a more complicated decision diagram. And there might be different follow-on treatments, and this is a particular issue in evaluating treatments for cancer, and I'll come back to a particular example of that in a moment. So in theory, if there's any variation of the way the technology is provided, which is specifiable and where, at least in theory, research evidence might be available to show differences in costs or effects, then it might require expanding the decision problem. Of course, the actual availability of research evidence usually constrains decision problems to a more manageable level. The key point here is that this can't be known even at the point of developing a protocol. It can only really be known after you've conducted your systematic reviews of the evidence. So sequencing of treatments. Now, I'm expecting Richard to know about this one a bit.
Me?
There are 2 Novartis drugs tucked in there. So, of course, this is, I think, Steve, the other day you talked about codependent technologies. And whenever you have any sequences of treatments, they're kind of codependent because the cost effectiveness of your first treatment partly depends on what patients are allowed to get or likely to get after each treatment. People know this in testing and screening programs, but it's also common where drugs for cancer become available usually firstly for third line or rescue treatment, and then for second line when the existing treatment doesn't work, and then lastly they tend to get licensed and applied for first line. So I'm just going to quickly look at these 3 drugs for chronic myeloid leukemia, which we looked at about 2 years ago. So these are tyrosine kinase inhibitors for chronic myeloid leukemia. Imatinib was one of the first biologics globally. Then about 2008, 2009, certainly in the UK, I think they were licensed. One, nilotinib, developed by Novartis, who were the original developers of imatinib as well, and dasatinib by Bristol Myers Squibb. So we've got 3 drugs in the same class, although the later versions have got a novel mode of action. Each can be used in the chronic phase as first or second line, or in the accelerated or blast phase of chronic myeloid leukemia. And then, of course, we've also got an existing blend of non-TKI treatments. So we've got potentially 4 comparators at each level. So you do end up with an absolutely crazy number of alternative possible sequences. And then you've got the other problem that trial evidence tends to only compare the initial thing that people were randomised for, not alternative sequences of different drugs. So the decision problem does get complicated, but it's ultimately simplified by the trial evidence only having compared certain pairs, usually, of drugs. Clinical expert opinion, whereby some sequences are deemed implausible, so that if people fail on dasatinib or nilotinib, some clinicians would say, well, why would you put them back on imatinib, or they wouldn't necessarily benefit from the older generation drug. This was made really more complicated. I can only say this because it's 2 or 3 years on, and more interesting because at the time we were evaluating first-line treatments for CML, NICE was about to issue guidance for the second-line treatment. So there was a window of time when not only were we evaluating these 3 drugs for first-line, but we didn't know which of the 3 drugs or whether all 3 drugs were going to be allowed for second-line treatment. Novartis pulled the fast one, which is shorthand for applying for and getting a discount in exactly the time window within weeks that they could have done, thus pulling the rug from under their competitor. terms of drug price. So we were able to go with the view that it was likely to be nilotinib that was the only second-line treatment recommended by NICE. So, just to summarise those various examples and what we can learn from them, separate listings of PICO criteria are simply not enough to develop a sound and logical decision tree from which to calculate cost effectiveness. Somehow we have to assess the clinical validity and scientific evidence for all possible treatment alternatives for achieving specified outcomes in a given patient group. This can't really be set in stone at the beginning. It can alter as the technology assessment progresses. And so decision problems will often either expand and multiply when evidence emerges of subgroup effects or variations in treatment delivery, or sometimes they'll shrink when the evidence of the flaws of the treatment alternatives simply does not exist. So I think we need better guidance and transparency of approaches for how we do this and how we describe what we've done, because there's an analytical process that goes on here between the scope and the actual specification of the decision problem. Next, I'm just going to briefly talk about what population we simulate in an economic analysis is also critically important. Of course, policies last for many years, so they affect not just the current population of patients with a given condition, but also all future patient populations. Yet, model-based economic evaluations still tend to estimate the cost effectiveness of either those people who've currently got the condition or the next future incident cohort. So a hypothetical cohort of people of a particular age who are deemed to get the condition next. So just to show what that means graphically, if you imagine you've got the population of patients with a given condition who exist at the moment, that's the prevalent cohort. But each year there's a new cohort of patients who are diagnosed, and then in all subsequent years. And it's actually all of these populations shown on this graph who are going to be affected by the decision. So the simple argument that it is that any economic analysis should simulate the costs and effects for all of these populations. This insight and idea actually started with work that I did here with a master's student from York on the basis of a cervical screening model that I did with Marion Haas and Marion Shanahan. And I had one of those niggling ideas that I hadn't quite tied up the loose ends or explained it properly. So I worked with a colleague who's far more mathematically able than I am to demonstrate algebraically that whether you simulate instant and prevalent cohorts really does make a difference to the ICEs, and it can make a massive difference, particularly where you have different discount rates for costs and benefits, but sometimes simply because of the different characteristics of newly diagnosed and existing patients. So we concluded that for treatments in many... Now I'm just going to briefly touch on a couple of issues to do with the implementation of technologies or programs and the scale of uptake and how this messes up your neat decision problem yet again. First of all, I'm going to look at smoke alarms in homes to prevent fire-related injuries. So this is one of the only examples from the work we did for the public health side of NICE. And then I'll go back to the example of cardiac synchronization therapy. So we developed a very generic model for any safety feature within households, leading to 3 levels of injury, but critically where the actual functioning of the device is assumed not to be permanent, that it decays over time. And so our model could take evidence from different sources and first of all assume, well, how many homes have already got a smoke alarm? Of the remaining homes, how many would actually accept one if it was given or offered at discount? And And then what's the decay function? So you end up with this shaded area of actual effectiveness of different policies and programs. And then we were able to just simply vary these different preliminary assumptions. And this diagram, this leads on to sort of the key point in the middle of the talk, is that models, especially in areas like public health, where the really firm evidence runs out very quickly, you end up doing more exploratory analyses to illustrate the key trade-offs going on in a particular policy area. And so diagrams like this that help policymakers deliberate about either the quality of the evidence or the range of options, the range of policies that they might specify, are extremely useful. And they step away from this presumption that it's all about the cost per quality, which is an easy thing to get the impression of in relation to health technology assessment. With the cardiac resynchronization therapy evaluation, we hit another thing that we hadn't hit before. I mean, generally, when you're introducing a new drug for a particular patient group, you're looking at marginal effects. You're not looking to create whole new cohorts of professionals who would have to be trained and employed to deliver a new technology. And what we came across in the cardiac resynchronization therapy evaluation was that if NICE said yes to these devices, then there simply wouldn't be enough of these cardiac catheter labs anywhere in the country. So we had to do some research to find out, well, how much would it cost to create all of these new catheter laboratories across the whole of the United Kingdom, and then find a way of allocating those capital costs back to the technology. I think there's a parallel here with the way when you do evaluations of testing, and that you have to incorporate the cost of the testing as well as the cost of the treatments that might follow different results from the test. So there's all these ways in which your nice neat decision problem can get muddied and messed up. So this is, I think, quite a neat quotation from Mike Drummond. He's here talking about systematic reviews, where we're saying, well, actually, perhaps we need to move away from them being about producing single outputs, and it's more about understanding the structure of the resource allocation problem. And within that, a review or a decision model should focus less on producing a summarised estimate of the cost-effectiveness ratio and more on demonstrating by how much it varies from setting to setting and why it varies. So in summary, both because of methodological creep, so by this I mean just the ever-increasing standards of both conducting economic analysis but also presenting them, CACs, we've got cost-effectiveness acceptability curves, we've all got to do probabilistic sensitivity analysis these days, certainly in the UK. And then, of course, the messiness of actual decision problems and simulating the real populations that we affected by decision mean that we have to depart from the original PICO scope. But we have decision maker and clinical experts and health service experts to decide what are actually feasible ways of using the technology. And within that, we've also got the problem of defining, well, what is usual or best practice care, because that's often a hybrid of all sorts of things. So you do end up with extremely complicated models, and this is actually just the Markov model for one arm of the model for that evaluation. And then you end up with, sorry about the fuzziness of these slides, just reams and reams of numbers with different types of output from a given model. So that's half the table. There's the other half of the table. And that's for just one of 8 scenarios that were in this health technology assessment. And then if you look at sensitivity analysis, so you're only looking at the incremental cost-effectiveness ratios here under different assumptions, you end up with tables like this, and this is 1/4 of this table. which of course all leads to utterly massive reports for these poor committee members to read. So when we looked at the 4 Alzheimer's drugs, the main report was 403 pages long, the appendices were 173 pages, 137 tables, 95 diagrams. The 3 biologic drugs for CML, similarly daunting amounts of information that somebody's supposed to read the day before the meeting, or, God forbid, on the train to the meeting. So it's no wonder that committee members look a bit like this when they get to the meeting. So this is kind of the fulcrum of the talk, where I talk about the back end of HTA. And well, how do we? This is a problem, because what we're talking about here is if we're putting in all this HTA analytical effort, and the more we put in, the more comprehensive we can define our decision problems and gather evidence, and the more methodological rigour we can use to synthesise it. What's happening here is that our transparency and usability to decision makers begins to plummet pretty quickly. And so we've started looking at various graphical methods to try and enable committee members, decision makers, to understand both the complexity of the methods that are sometimes used, but also the complexity of the outcomes. So this is based on the research of a PhD student who was with us from 2007 to 2011. As will become apparent in a moment, he's a graphic artist, not a health services researcher. So he developed about 10 ideas for how to simplify some of the complexity that emerges in big HTA reports. One is to do with summarising the actual evidence of systematic reviews, the GOFA tool, and the other one is to try and explain where the ISA comes from in relation to a specific economic analysis from a specific model. So this is the typical format to try and understand the variety of study characteristics in a systematic review. You end up with massive tables, variety of facts and numbers listed within them. And we'll turn this into something which is specifically designed to enable you to spot really key differences either in study design. So you can see we've got one randomised trial there at the top, but it's relatively small. Then you've got a non-randomised comparative study, so a controlled before and after study, if you like, at the bottom, and an uncontrolled before and after study here, and then going off to the right. So this is for the cochlear implant review that we conducted. And then a kind of a coding frame for assessing the quality of the study as well. And then you've got the outcome measures off to the right. And there's the key to go for graphical summary. And this is one that was the first one to appear in one of our actual pieces of work. This is in the review of drugs for Alzheimer's. So over here you can see which studies have got a comprehensive range of outcome measures across both the cognitive, functional, behavioural and global domains. If you look at this study, it looks very high quality in terms of how it meets the different criteria for judging the quality of a randomised trial, but it's got quite an unusual gender balance compared to the other studies, and it's also got a much older age group. So the whole essence of these diagrams is to enable you to much more quickly, much more easily spot groups of similar studies or ones that are real outliers in terms of design or quality. And he did some randomised testing with technical analysts at NICE in terms of how quickly and how accurately they could find particular information or identify studies that met certain characteristics. And it seemed to perform very well, although that was a study with fairly small sample sizes. And there's other ideas and publications beginning to emerge along a similar theme. This one's more geared to how to depict the results of comparative studies developed by Hilary Thompson at Glasgow. And there's a reference list at the end for any of you who are interested in this. I think this one's really neat, and I often look at a cloud of numbers and different p-values on a systematic review and think, well, what is this telling me? And I think this enables you to genuinely spot patterns and similarities and omissions. So that's all about understanding the outputs from model-based cost effectiveness analyses. Systematic reviews. The other problem is when people, especially when committees, given how many pages they have to plough through, end up getting to the point in a report where there's an incremental cost effectiveness ratio, they tend to blow over and everything else goes blank, and they don't remember where it came from and why it's bigger for this patient group or smaller for this patient group. And so there are usually a very, very small group of people who understand actually how the numbers have been generated and why they alter when certain patient characteristics alter. So, of course, there's a few established ways of saying, well, where does the ISA come from? One might be the kind of bar charts where you show, well, what are the cost differences between two arms in a model and what makes them up? But you lose, and then this shows how much time people spend in different health states in a relatively simple Markov model. But you lose the dynamic, the time-related dimension, so you don't know how much this is affected by discounting, or whether some of these quality gains are made in the early years, or actually they only appear in year 20 of your model. So we'll develop this state occupancy chart, which combines on the right-hand side, you've got the kind of graph you might create anyway to show what proportion of a simulated cohort are in different health states, and then in either the treatment arm or the placebo arm of a model. But in the middle, we've got the cumulative costs and outcome differences, so that you can actually begin to grasp where the ISA comes from. And he's developed that into software, which we're hoping to make freely available, so that you don't have to be a graphic artist to create diagrams. So, conclusions. HTA, because it fundamentally is policy evaluation, it isn't a cookbook of universally applicable methods to decision problems which are set in stone. A great deal of analysis and judgment is required to specify or re-specify the decision problem from the original PICO defined scope. Often revision and renegotiation of the decision problem is expected, especially after reviewing the evidence. Subgroup differences will especially trigger this, but also the wide variety of ways in which different technologies can be provided, whether for different durations of exposure, different doses or different sequences. So, as well as the model structure and the parameter values and all the usual characteristics of decision models, we've also got to pay more attention to exactly what populations are we going to simulate with this model. So high quality technology assessment tends to involve more iteration between the evidence and the decision problem, regular consultation with both the decision makers and the clinical or service experts about what are the actual realistic comparators. And I've firmly come to believe, and this is reinforced by the work I've done on the public health side of NICE, that the actual process of building models and using them to identify and illustrate key trade-offs is often as important to the process of policy deliberation as the ISAs and the actual outputs. So it'd be interesting to know whether there are ways of engaging the decision makers earlier in that process, or at least making that process more visible to them in our reports. And there's this pervasive danger of losing transparency and usability in our quest for ever more refined and rigorous methods. And I think novel graphical techniques might play a part in helping us avoid those dangers. So some references that if you want to follow some of those ideas I've found useful. And thank you very much. Happy to take your questions.
Yes, do people have questions or comments for Rob?
Well, I guess the obvious question, Rob, is if you were setting up a system somewhere else, what would you do differently to NICE?
For the technology assessment? Not a great deal, actually, because when I've pushed them, or when we've had to push them, so for example in the chronic myeloid leukemia one, there was so much complexity in deciding what treatment sequences were plausible. The clinical evidence went up to 2 years maximum, but people in that patient group did it for 15 to 20 years. So there were 3 different ways of extrapolating from the empirical evidence to people's full lifetimes. We kind of tipped them off. We're not going to be doing a probabilistic sensitivity analysis for this one. There's too much structural uncertainty. There's too much structural uncertainty and too many other alternatives in the way these analyses could be done. And we think it's better that we explore those in a more deterministic way. Because they have this army of people called technical advisors and technical analysts who manage this process below the committee level. And that gives you a point of negotiating what you're going to do. So that seems to work. I do think some guidance on what is a decision problem and how do you define it properly would be good, because I still think that is a bit of a black box. And yet, whether you include or exclude certain comparators in any given analysis makes a massive amount of, potentially makes a massive amount of difference. And yet it's part of the process that nobody talks about much, but it goes on. So if anything, I'd want the methods guidance to be more explicit about that, and the methods guidance to perhaps say something about populations that should be simulated, rather than seeing the decision rules as only being a result of the static structure plus this big list of parameters that feed it. So those are the 2 main things.
Hi. How much do you think the decision makers look at and consider the probabilistic sensitivity analysis? And how informative is it?
Not as much as people think, I think, would be the accurate answer. I think when they see a table of incremental cost effectiveness rate, I've seen analyses when it comes to the crux after the first appraisal committee meeting, and they say, right, we think these are the key parameters that we don't understand. You often end up having to produce a table which is a multi-way sensitivity analysis of how the incremental cost effectiveness ratio varies according to 2 or 3 key variables. That still seems to me to be the type of evidence that most committee members are most comfortable with. Because, and I think that's tied to the fact that since 2004 we have explicit thresholds. So people resort to this simple judgment of, is it above 20,000 or above 30,000? And so I think CX are useful, but they're probably only looked at by the methodological specialists on the committee.
Quick question. I
Sure.
really liked the graphic displays and how they improve the usability of the reports. Do they make the reports shorter? And is there other things that you're looking into to try and make the reports as well more user-friendly for the policy advisors?
Yes, they do make, but certainly the first one, the gopher, that makes the reports shorter. The second one we haven't used in reports, but I think that single colourful diagram I showed you, the state occupancy graph, would probably replace 3 or 4 different diagrams that I would have previously tried to create. So I think they are quite economical. Having said that, NICE still only produces black and white pictures. And the side of it that this PhD student will really want to develop was more interactive, where you could just drill down, zoom in into information, so you could hover your mouse over something and it would show you where it came. Because that's really what it's about. You know, if you wanted to know, well, why is this number this big? You could hover over it and you see, well, actually, it's this number over that. And so he was quite keen to develop more colour-based and interactive versions of it. What was your second question?
Just wondering, is there anything other than graphics? Is there any other things that you are investigating that might make the reports more user-friendly?
No, we use just about every report writing device we can to make them usable and accessible. So if something doesn't really need to be in the train of thought and line of evidence, then we stick it in a or you put boxes around stuff. So no, use graphs for things and then stick all the numbers at page 573, I think is the main strategy we use, because we know that's all the committee members will probably want to do. Hi.
Just 2 questions. One, I guess, is a follow-up on that. I mean, you mentioned the gopher was used when you're looking at the technical analysts in NICE.
Yeah.
Did you get any feedback from the actual committee members about whether they were they found it helpful or useful? Because I know often committee members don't like text, and they often like to look at
Yeah.
tables.
No, we couldn't. I mean, within the context of a PhD, recruiting committee members who already have to read 11 of those reports every year, it was going to be just much harder to sample them and to get them to cooperate with a piece of research like this. I think so we did. I know Rosalie's got some work planned or ongoing where committee members, aren't PBAC committee members going to be answering a survey for you or something? Or am I getting involved with?
I think that was done. Not sure.
But on the spectrum of extremely busy people to completely not busy people, I think most committee members are right up the other end, and you're unlikely to get a very complete sample. But yeah, they are the ultimate customers in terms of who actually makes the decision. So yeah, that would have been nice. But we had to kind of go for technical analysts and technical advisors as a proxy for them.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rob.
Cheers.